For Crimo Media's Polity Mtabi Madiba, award-winning investigative journalist Anneliese Burgess joins me to discuss her book titled Heist. Welcome, Anneliese.
Thank you.
Your book is an in-depth look at 10 of South Africa's most audacious heists. So can you please briefly take us through your journey in putting together this book?
Okay, so when I started writing the book, we knew that this was a big problem. But when I started writing it a year ago, it wasn't the epidemic that it's become over the past year. But I wanted to write a story that was engaging. So I wanted to uncover the crime, I wanted people to understand the crime, but I wanted to do it in a way which was compelling to read. So I identified 10 heists over the last 20 years, a little bit more, and also looked at different kinds of heists. So, what is called vehicle-on-road heists, which are the classic heists where they ram vehicles off the road and then steal the money in the vans, or also cash center heists where people rob the centers that have the cash in them. And we also looked at a heist that happened in this very building where we are now, the Bedford Center heist, which was a robbery in a shopping center. So I went back to 1996 and started with what was known as the Broncos vehicle-on-road heist, which was probably the first of the new generation kind of heists, the ones that we've come to know, where vehicles are rammed on roads and high-powered firearms are used. A lot of shooting takes place, people get killed, and a lot of money gets stolen. So I started in 1996 with Broncos robbery, and I ended with a 2014 heist, which was the biggest heist in the history of South Africa, which took place in Witbank, or eMalahleni, and was a robbery of a cash center depot where 104 million rand was stolen. It wasn't the biggest heist in terms of money stolen, but it was an incredibly interesting heist because of the way it was executed.
You spoke to Sihle Chabalala, who was 16 when he was involved in his first heist and 20 when he was arrested, and he spent 11 years in prison. He gave you inside information about heist. So can you briefly explain the planning process of a heist according to Sihle?
So Sihle is a very interesting man. I mean, he runs an incredible NGO in Mitchell's Plain, and he's completely changed his life. And he was very happy to speak about what he calls his first life, which was this life as a youngster when he got involved in this crime. We have insight about cash and transit heists from many other criminals who were interviewed in prison, not by me, but by two incredible researchers. But Sihle was an interesting case because he spoke of his personal experience. And the one thing that stands out about heists is, for me, and Sihle speaks about it, is how well they are planned. It's not just people who decide one day to hit a van and steal a lot of money and live the high life. These are very well planned crimes. They recruit people who have skills in specific areas, people who can shoot well, people who can drive well, people who are specialists in ramming vehicles. I mean, you have to know how to ram a van off the road. It's not just getting in a car and doing it. You have to know how fast to go. You have to know at what point of impact you need to go in. And Sihle, the thing about his story for me that is so incredible is he explained all of this planning. Also how a lot of surveillance takes place beforehand. People check out the routes, they make sure that the same routes are followed, they check police response times. So that was the one very interesting thing that Sihle spoke about. But I think the other thing that came out of what Sihle explained is this lure of making huge amounts of money. I mean, he speaks at one point, he says it's like, I can't remember the exact words, I think he says it's like an enormous rush of ecstasy. He says the 24 hours before a heist, you can almost not wait. You just want this to happen. You're already starting to think what you're going to do with the money. And I think that the thing that comes out of that is that, this crime is not a crime necessarily of need, of desperate people needing money. It's a crime of greed, of people, of an easy way to make a lot of money.
And you stated that Witbank is South Africa's #1 hotspot for cash in transit and banking-related crimes. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's not me saying that. It's the South African Banking Risk Information Centre, SABRIC. But I have a very good idea why. Witbank is an interesting geographical location. It's on the main routes up to the north, to Mozambique, to Swaziland, and that kind of vast rural area there. So these vans have to go through Witbank to get to those areas. And Witbank also has a very big cash center depot, the one that I spoke about, which was robbed in 2014. So it's a big concentration of money there, and there are a lot of vehicles that have to go through that town. But, excuse me, I think one of the other reasons, and this is something that police officers tell me, is that there seems to be a particularly big problem with the police in the northern provinces, Limpopo and Mpumalanga. There seems to be a big corruption problem there. So my sense is that this is a safe place in which to hit vans, because your chances of getting arrested are very low, and the chances of being taken to court are even lower, and the chances of you being prosecuted are almost zero. So I think it's a very attractive place for this crime to take place.
And a security company insider, or fingers as it is known in the criminal underworld, seems to lead to the success of these crimes. So what do you think companies can do to get rid of this culture of fingers?
So yes, it's an interesting term, the term of a finger. Inside, they talk about a finger man, but often it's a finger woman. Inside person with inside knowledge, who then provides that critical information to the syndicates or gangs that do this crime. I've spoken to security companies about it. There's very little you can do. The people are screened. Many of these companies also do regular polygraph testing and so on. But the lure of money is a big thing. I mean, I think, in the 2014 Witbank case, very interesting to follow that story of how that particular finger was a woman, how she was groomed to become part of the robbery. Initially, she was a person who had a lot of responsibility. She was, I can't remember the exact term of what her job description was, but she was a person in charge of security in this cash center. And initially she didn't want to get involved. She was scared of getting caught, and these guys, they groomed her. They slowly, convinced her that she won't be caught. It'll be fine. They know what they're doing. They've done this many times before. Nobody's ever been caught. And then the money. You're going to make a lot of money. And I think, I don't know how you stop that. I think it's almost impossible. But what a cash management company said to me is that, one has to keep your people happy. If the people who work for the company are happy, it brings down the chances of people turning against the company and doing something like this. But I think at the end of the day, when you have the chance of getting a couple of million rand, I think there are very few people who might not at least consider it.
And shockingly, you revealed that state officials, magistrates and prosecutors are frequently corrupted. Criminals feel that they have control over the police. So tell us about the relationship between criminals and the people that are supposed to be protecting citizens.
I think the biggest shock for me that came out of writing this book was to understand how deep the corruption networks in the police service and in the criminal justice system go. I mean, I looked at 10 heists in my book. Only 3 of those heists took place without police involvement, and I'm talking about big-time police involvement. One of the heists, the Witbank case that I've spoken about a couple of times now, that was run, planned, executed by a person who was a serving police officer in Witbank, supported by a couple of people who had been reservists. The person who was brought in to make the case collapse once they realized that their initial plan didn't work so well was an ex-Hawks captain who was paid 40 million rand to make the thing go away. There's a heist I speak about that happened in Pinetown there were 2 heists, in fact, that were planned and executed by an entire group of cops at the Chatsworth police station. But it goes deeper than that. I was very shocked by what people told me. You know, intelligence officers who say another big problem is that, yeah, okay, so you have police that are involved and maybe execute the heist, but then you also have police officers who can be bought off. So there are many ways to make these cases go away. You buy off the investigating officer, or you then, if that doesn't work, you buy off the prosecutor. And then, shockingly enough, I'm told you can even buy off a magistrate. And in one case, I was told that people know of a judge that was bought off. So there is an incredibly scary vein of corruption that runs all the way through. I'm not saying all people are corrupt. My book tells amazing stories about incredible police officers, incredible state prosecutors who go to enormous lengths to actually put people behind bars. But I think the one thing that comes out of my book is that your chances of being caught are very small. Your chances of then being taken to court and are even smaller, because you can do all kinds of stuff to stop that from happening. And if you then do get to court, your chances of a successful prosecution are very, very low. I think it's a very shocking fact of life in South Africa, and where it really struck home for me was I interviewed a defense attorney, a lawyer, and he was a big-time player in the 80s, early 90s. He was one of the go-to guys for heist criminals. And when I interviewed him, he said to me, I don't get the big jobs anymore because it's become easier and cheaper to make the case go away. And we know what that means. You're going to buy off someone to make it go away.
Speak to us about the investigating officer, Vinol, who was offered bribes of between 400,000 and 1 million rand, and he had his family threatened. He was on the Broncos sprayed case. Briefly tell us about that case.
So Vinol is an incredible policeman. He's a man who has investigated many heist cases. In fact, he was the investigating officer on the Broncos sprayed case, but then he was also the investigating officer on a very big and very brutal case just after that called Marble Hall. And in fact, today he's been brought back into the police to spearhead cash in transit investigations because he's seen to be a specialist in the field. But he told me an incredible story, which I go into in quite great detail in my book about the Broncos sprayed case. So the first time he was offered a bribe, it was by the criminals themselves who offered him 400,000 rand. They would take the criminals back and forth from the court to the prison. And so there was a lot of FaceTime with him. And he was offered a bribe for 400,000 rand to say him and to collapse this case. And he refused to do it because he's one of those incredibly stubborn, ethical, upstanding, honest policemen. And then towards the end of the case, when all the shenanigans didn't work, there were a lot of legal attempts to win the case for the criminals, the defense lawyers. He was then, one day he was in the High Court, he was making photocopies, and one of the defense lawyers came to him and he said to him, you must just testify right. I've been instructed that we will pay you a bar, which is $1 million, if you testify right. And he tells this incredibly funny story of how he lost his cool and he wanted to beat the guy up, and he didn't do it. And then it was in the last dying days of the case. And then, clearly, as a last resort, the criminals decided that they needed to do something even more dramatic. So they told him that they were going to come for his family. And he didn't believe them. And then one day, his wife, his car was basically burst into flames after she had been at an engagement. And he never told her that he believed it had been a message from the criminals, but he lied to her and said it was a mechanical failure. But today he's open about it and he says it was their last chance. They wanted to make me scared and they wanted me to recant my testimony.
And can you talk to us about how heisters use a truck and a spike chain to run the cash van off the road?
Okay, so in 1996 with the Broncos Spruit case, the one that I spoke about, the first big classic vehicle on road attack, they used a spike chain across the road. The armored vehicles go over. It takes out their tires, so it stops them from being able to drive very fast. And it also then, in that specific case, took out the escort vehicles. So it worked in that sense. And then once the vehicles were disabled, then there were criminals waiting on the verges of the road, and they opened fire, and that's how the heist took place. It was a classic maneuver that apparently the police believe was seen by these criminals in a movie called Heat. It was a big movie at the time. And in that movie, they used the spike chain. And the policemen believe, in fact, the criminals told them. They found copies of the DVD in some of these people's houses. So it was inspired by the movie. And then the Broncos, the Marble Hall case, I think it was a year or two after, maybe a year later, they also wanted to use a chain, but for some reason they didn't have time to pull it across the road, but the police found also a spike chain next to the road. I don't know of many other cases where that's been used. I think the classic case is now, the classic way of doing it is to ram a vehicle with a very sturdy other vehicle, usually one of these old Mercedes or vehicles with good security features like what do you call those things? The bags that come out to protect you. So the spike chain was an interesting story because it was inspired by the movie, but it's not a classic way of doing it. The classic way is to ram the vehicles with another vehicle.
And do you agree with Justice Theo that criminals have developed a lack of respect and fear for the arm of law?
I'm afraid that is the inevitable conclusion one has to come to after you've looked at it as closely as I do. It's what I said earlier. One of the police officers said to me, it's not rocket science. He says, if criminals knew that the chances of being caught, the chances of being prosecuted, and the chances of ending up in prison were high, people would think twice. But it's not only relating to heists. It's relating to violent crime in South Africa, I think. Violent criminals don't have that much to fear because the chances of being successfully prosecuted are relatively small.
And do you think the people that are committing these crimes are the ones that are poor and vulnerable?
I think all crime, obviously, with all crime that involves stealing money or stealing, like in heists, obviously there will be people who will be doing this because they are poor. I mean, if you live in a country like South Africa where there are so many poor people and there's such a big difference between the people who have and the people who have not, of course that's going to be a factor. But having analyzed these 10 heists, these aren't people who are poverty-stricken or desperate. A lot of these people are actually professional criminals who see themselves as business people. It's a business. Cash and transit heist is a business. These guys put money in, they invest in their business. And interestingly enough, when you go through the judgments of many of these cases, then many of the judges will outline what people's personal circumstances are. And for instance, in the 2006 airport heist, he goes through people's circumstances, and all the kingpins are people who've had jobs. I mean, people who either, the one guy was earning 20,000 Rand, I think, as a long-distance truck driver, so he wasn't poverty-stricken, and often these criminals also have a history as guards or having worked in cash management companies. So to answer your question, of course, I think it is a factor with crime in South Africa. You can't live in a country like ours with a big difference in what some people have and what some people don't have. But with cash in transit heists, I'm afraid I think the major factor is one of greed.
And lastly, do you think it is easy for criminals to discontinue committing crimes after they are released from jail?
So my initial thought was going in, I thought, yes, you go to prison, okay, you sit there for 15, 20 years. The last thing I'm going to want to do when I come out is get back and do that all again. But I spoke to an incredible researcher, from UNISA. Her name is Dr. Mohlanolo Tobane, and she interviewed a lot of these cash criminals in prison. And one of the things that she investigated was whether people will do this again if they get let out. And almost all of them said, the one guy was quoted as saying, it's a vocation, it's my job. You are what you do, and this is what I am. The one guy said, she asked him, so do you think people will stop doing this? And he said to her, I'm very doubtful that anyone will. So out of the mouths of people who actually commit these crimes, they're saying that it's what they do. And it's one of the big worries of cash in transit companies also. For instance, they track release dates, because they know that when a batch of people get released, and they know obviously to what geographical area they will be released, they start checking those release dates because they expect a spike in the crime, because people see this as a job. They have pride in it. It's their job, and they will go back and do it.
Thank you for your time. That was award-winning investigative journalist Anneliese Burgess speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about her book titled Heist.